A shocking new RBC report has come out and it is showing how the Canadian real estate bubble is imploding. And also another shocking report from National Bank has been released, which shows Canada is heading into a depression. So let's start off with the RBC report. So Canadian real estate markets aren't firming up with rate cuts. Demand is softening. RBC is warning investors that early data shows rate cuts failed to stimulate major markets in July. In fact, they generally observed the opposite trend. Sales continued to weaken while inventory climbed as investors tried to lighten up their market exposure in key regions, or key super bubbles, should they say, like Toronto. Now, very interesting. Let's go straight into the real estate data here so you can see exactly what's going on. So you can see on this chart here that the sales for July, they're up barely anything, right? They've barely changed. When you look at some of the changes that you've had in the past, this is barely anything. They're pretty much flat. But here's the interesting thing. When you look at new listings, they've consistently gone up. So you're seeing more and more people list their homes. So it looks more and more likely the case that the interest rate cuts were adding actually more fuel to the downside, because you have a lot of buyers that are already priced out the market. There's nothing they can do. You've got the unemployment rate rising. You've got sentiment that is worsening there. And as prices decline as well, you have more and more people go to the sidelines and wait it out. And then you've had the people that are waiting to sell. They were the ones duped into the narrative from the real estate industry, which was, hey, as soon as these interest rate cuts, that's going to be the time to list your house. That'll be perfect timing for you. And they've completely got it the opposite way round, as they normally do, because they don't have a clue what they're talking about. And unfortunately, it's just classic human emotion and psychology, is that people want to relate fundamentals to these bubbles. But the reality is they are just that. They're a real estate bubble. So you can't go saying, oh yeah, it's interest rate cuts, it's population growth, it's all these different things. And we're going to blow apart half those narratives in this video anyway. So stay tuned, guys. So the Bank of Canada rates cuts marked a turning point for real estate, according to RBC, not because of what the markets did, but because of what they didn't do. Neither the June or July rate cuts were able to stimulate buyers' psychology. After a small uptick between May and June, home resales fell again in some markets, including Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto in July. Calgary we'll get onto in a minute, because you've got incredible amounts of speculation going on there, and I'm just going to prove that to you with the data instead of just saying it. So according to early reports from local real estate boards, explains Robert Hogue, assistant chief economist at RBC. The bank doesn't see recent cuts as stimulating much demand. They believe much deeper cuts will need to be seen before mortgages are cheap enough to stimulate markets. Again, they're just thinking soft landing's coming. They're just going to be cutting rates into this economy that's going to be getting better and better and better. We know that's not the case, because we are not duped by these stupid, ridiculous government figures that we are fed. I constantly tell you how they're manipulated, show you how they're manipulated, and you've seen that with the unemployment reports that I cover on a monthly basis, the inflation reports, which I occasionally cover, because that is by far the stupidest numbers that they put out are the inflation numbers. So stupid that I don't even cover them most of the time. But anyway, it's really interesting what you've got going on there, especially that you've got markets like Calgary now turning. I mean, these were the quote-unquote affordable markets that would boom. I mean, it was just going to skyrocket there when they started cutting rates, because it was already affordable, guys. It was already affordable. So when they start cutting rates, it's just even more affordable. People are just going to rush into that market. And the complete opposite has happened. So it just goes to show, you know, people think, oh yeah, we're just going to go to this market. I'm sure I'll be fine. It hasn't gone up as much. And they have not looked at what's happened over the past 2 years, where you've had over the past 4 years in Calgary, prices are probably up over 50%, which is completely insane and unsustainable, especially when you look at the income and economy in Alberta. So incredibly interesting what RBC is seeing. seeing there. And then you've got Calgary, seller's market, Edmonton, seller's market. Let's just dig into Calgary. Same thing is going on in Edmonton. Why is it a seller's market right now? So let's look. We're looking at the rental report for the entire Calgary metro area, and we're looking at the historical amount of listings so that we can see how much speculation is going on. And if you look here, it was around May 2023, listings hit a low point, and then you've just gone parabolic. I mean, year over year, guys, you're nearly at double the amount of listings. So you've nearly had listings of rentals in Calgary go up 100% in 1 year. I mean, that is just completely insane. And if more and more people can't sell their homes, what are they going to do? They're going to flip it to the rental market. So you're going to see this continue to go up. I mean, this is exactly the same cycle as happened before in 2015, 2016. We're just repeating history with different narratives. It's just unbelievable that people get duped into this time and time again, and you just see it on repeat. I mean, it's hilarious. It really is hilarious. It just shows we're dealing with a bunch of sheep and cows that are just herd mentality. It's just herd mentality, and it just breeds more herd mentality. And then you've got Canadian GDP driven by the public sector. Per capita recession deepens here. So Canada's economy beat expectations, but dive into the details before celebrating. Statistics Canada StatCan data shows real gross domestic product, GDP, grew faster than expected in May. However, even with the rapid public sector expansion driving half the advance, it failed to meet population growth. As a result, Canada's GDP per capita recession printed an 8th consecutive quarter of losses. So let's get into the chart. So Canada's growth is failing to keep up with the pace of its population, and it's getting worse. Indeed, on a per capita basis, GDP declined by 1% in the second quarter, explains Matthew Arsenault, Deputy Chief Economist at National Bank. So you can see what's going on here. You've got GDP, and then you've got GDP per capita, and it just keeps going down. GDP per capita just keeps falling. The standard of living of Canadians keeps going down. I mean, even if you go back as far as 2021, you can see that, and you've got to remember, guys, a lot of what you see here happening in 2021 was the economic distortions created by the government. Again, the government is still maintaining those economic distortions. It's just that you've got an even worse economy from the private sector side. So those places where the economy is really reliant on private sector, which is places like, funnily enough, Alberta, those places are going to be particularly hit hard when rubber meets the road. So incredibly interesting what's going on here. And then you've got Canadian credit demand is rapidly collapsing despite population growth. And again, I just wanted to show you this because this kind of blows apart that narrative that population growth is the reason why the housing bubble is going up. Don't get me wrong, it totally contributes towards the housing bubble, but it is not the sole reason. People like to blame immigrants for lots of different things when in fact immigrants are actually working really hard doing the jobs that most people don't want to do. And unfortunately, they were just part of a cycle where they got duped into moving, and it's not their fault at all. It's mainly the speculators, the banking system, and the government that are at fault here. And it's definitely that banking system, in my opinion. And I think a lot of the blame is deflected away from the banks and towards immigrants because it's just easier for people to pick on those members of society. I mean, if you go back to 2008, exactly the same thing happened. But let's be real here. Obviously, immigration does impact the housing bubble because it drives up rental demand, and it also means that, hey, you've got more rental demand, changes the equation for investment properties, which then encourages more speculation. So it's not directly affecting the housing bubble because if you didn't have the banking system, which was lending, and if you didn't have the speculators there, then you wouldn't have the massive housing bubble that we have today. If the banks were very risk off, don't want to lend, which is what happens when consequently a housing bubble implodes, then guess what? You don't have all this credit demand. And you look right now at this chart, you can see that credit demand, if you go back to 1991, we are at a massive low for the growth rate of credit, which is crazy when you think about the growth rate of the population and add that in there to the mix as well. You've got Air Canada that's coming out and saying, hey, people are starting to cut back on vacations here. And you look at what's going on with their earnings. Obviously, they fell dramatically and completely missed on their earnings. And you've also got the Canadian Tire CEO that's coming out and saying consumer spending is softening. You've got people that are highly indebted, and obviously the interest rate cuts still having massive impacts. But it's interesting because they constantly go back to this. They constantly say Bank of Canada interest rate cuts could ease uncertainties in our business operations. Guys, don't fall for any of this complete nonsense because that is not the case. The reason why the Bank of Canada is cutting is because they're behind the curve. The data is highly manipulated, but even with the manipulated data, they're beginning to see that, hey, the economy's soft. The real estate market is most of the economy and it's cracking here. And they think that interest rate cuts are just going to mean this thing is going to rip higher and it's going to boom again. But they're incredibly mistaken. They don't have a clue. They believe in all these old methods like the Phillips curve that have been debunked many, many times. And interestingly enough, I just want to go back to Calgary once again, because if you look at what's happening with prices are pretty much softening, and year over year, they're not growing anymore. They're not doing anything. So even though you've got housing prices that are up in Calgary, I would look at what's going on in these markets: Quebec City, Calgary, Edmonton, Halifax, all these markets where speculators just piled into them purely because of the price, because that's how stupid a lot of these investors are. But hey, if there's a lot of people and they're all grouping together like a herd and there's a narrative, you've got fuel for a bubble there, and all you need is a match to light it up. And that's exactly what happened. And you can see that it's not growing anymore, guys. So with practically no growth, inflation's still very high in these places because of what's happening with the cost of living and desperate immigrants wanting to move to the cheaper places, which ironically then pushes up the cost of living for everything because there's not any jobs, there's not any economic growth. So they just take more away, and their reliance on the government, it just influences the economy and unfortunately makes inflation worse. You're beginning to see the real fundamental value of real estate in these places is dropping. Little do these speculators and investors even notice or probably realize what's going on here. So it'll be incredibly interesting to see what happens in these markets. We'll continue to monitor it. So if you've enjoyed this video, I'd highly recommend that you check out this video here. And if you're looking for a VPN to protect your privacy, go down into the description, affiliate link there. That's the VPN that I use, and you need a VPN these days. I will see you in the next one. Take care.